Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand.
You can't be the PM that never promises a date because other people then can't do their job. Sales can't do their job effectively. There might be stakeholders that can't.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, I am rejoined once again by Bailey O'Shea. Bailey and I have gotten to work together on a number of engagements when she served as the head of product at Integral. She led the product and design teams, and we got to work on building products and enabling product teams at clients like Ford, Honda, Airstream, Bosch, Rocket Mortgage. And in that time, we've noticed that we've had to retrofit a number of conversations around context and sometimes even culture that teams have forgotten to have that lead to a lot of downstream issues. On today's episode, we talk about timelines. Now, you probably have some sense of timelines on your product teams, but not necessarily the context around it or some of the additional information that can help you with prioritizing, shipping faster, as well as satisfying some of the constraints that inevitably come up as you're prioritizing your roadmap and satisfying all of your stakeholders and, most importantly, your customers. Bailey brings a wealth of experience, not just from her time at Integral, but also from previous roles that she's played at innovation labs at General Motors, where she worked directly with folks from IDEO and learned a lot of great product practices, as well as spending a lot of time on the marketing side of the auto industry. I enjoyed the episode a lot, getting to rehash some of the things that we've had to retrofit on the product teams we worked on. I hope you enjoy it too. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. So we're going to talk today about timelines. And that being a really important discussion that, of course, I think timelines are not a discussion that maybe folks forget to have. It's oftentimes the first thing that you hear is that this needs to get done by this time. And so it's maybe more of the, how do we nuance this conversation and things that we've uncovered much later that maybe we can help folks out with trying to have earlier. We like to do in our early workshop. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think especially if you're at an enterprise environment or maybe an environment that's turning around from historically waterfall, or maybe it's project-led rather than product-led. The tendency is to lead with a milestone because then people have something to work backward from. I think the really important nugget, though, isn't always when, but it's why, and really digging into the why. Maybe that, it could just be a dart at the wall. It could be a budgetary reason, an external driver, an insight. There's many reasons that drive urgency from various areas of the org. So that's what I think of timeline. I think it's a start of a conversation rather than the end of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And the why part, I think, is probably, if there's one takeaway from all of this about timelines, it's clarifying that why and making it really safe for anyone who needs to ask why and ask how many other levels of why that you need. An example of something that we worked on that comes to mind is an internal payment, internal payment platform that our team was helping a client build. And there were many different customers, internal customers, that this payment platform was going to serve. Some of them were taking one-time payments, some of them were taking subscriptions, some of them were taking deposits, and there were different use cases for the different internal departments. And of course, they've all got their own product teams that are shipping product, and payments is a very critical part of, but not the only thing that they do. And so when we were looking to do the constraint satisfaction on our roadmap, and we talked to the different stakeholders, they had timelines that they sent us that they needed. And the initial conversation was super low fidelity. It might have been an email or like a Slack message that were between the team of when they need it by. And then it wasn't until we hopped on the phone with them and started to understand what drove that timeline for them, that some of them just flat out didn't have a good answer. They, it was, like you said, a shot in the dark, and they were doing some level of guesstimation and doing their best effort on that. We were certainly interrupting them with the question about timelines, about payments from whatever they were doing. And so for them to do detailed analysis would have been maybe more than we could expect. But if we didn't go have that in-depth conversation, we would have taken each of those Slack messages or emails about timelines at face value and assumed that there was in-depth need that was analyzed on the other end. And sometimes just hopping on the phone with folks, it can be a 20-minute call, understanding not just the payments part of it, but also, hey, how are things going with your part of the business? What's exciting on your roadmap? Who are you and what makes you excited? And getting to know kind of them on a personal level and getting to understand their roadmap and their outcomes they're driving as if you were on their team, then sets really good foundation to then within that context understand how is payments going to play a part, and when you need it, what level of complexity you need in payments. Sometimes it's just really, the heavy lifting is done on the customer side where they want to handle the recurring payments aspect and everything else, and they just want a really simple API call that allows them to process a payment. And other times, as that kind of use case becomes more recurring around the organization, like with most platforms, those individual applications that sit on the customer level get driven upstream into the platform so that everyone can use the same robust version of maybe recurring payments in this case. And understanding those requirements, their customer problems they're trying to solve, their roadmaps and their constraints uncovered so much more for us. And it took more work. It took for us to understand not just the payment space, but our customer space. But all of this additional effort led to so many more data points that we could then translate into insights when it came to our own roadmap. And then the second part, I think, was also negotiations that we had, because folks, especially like you said, if it's in a company that's transitioning out of a more project-based or waterfall-based approach into trying to be more lean and agile, there is some level of sort of trauma debt, if you will, from the last person that provided you the payments API that was way off in terms of delivering what they said they would, when they said they would, and everything else. So as a downstream consumer, it's natural to just want to add a little bit of padding and de-risking when you state that answer, which number one is going to be surfaced if you have like a high fidelity conversation about what their roadmap looks like. And then so are the trust issues, which now it's on us to go out and re-earn that trust. In this case, we realized that one of the big concerns with one of the teams was that the API never shows up the way that we had agreed on before. And so we wrote our Swagger docs early, and we gave them the Swagger docs within the next few weeks for how we intended to build the APIs that they were going to consume, and shared with them that, hey, not only are you going to not have any surprises now, you have the opportunity to influence what we've built way more before we've built it. And so give us your feedback on how this is coming in, ask us any questions about where we've arrived at these decisions. And so we get to validate what we're going to build as well by having just a higher trust conversation, which for whatever reason, I think at bigger companies, folks tend to be just a little bit more cagey and find it harder to share something like a Swagger doc well before we have started work on it, for fear that it will change, versus thinking about it as a mindset of like, well, I hope it changes in the documentation status if we're doing kind of the Swagger docs before the actual development. And maybe I should clarify that Swagger is a tool that we use to help with the publishing and documentation of our APIs for our customers. And it's taking almost like a test-driven development mindset of building the customer-facing thing first and then getting feedback and validation on that versus building the API and then building the documentation around it as an afterthought, which you're missing out on a huge opportunity for feedback by doing it that way, I think. So I think the why piece that you talked about really does uncover a lot. And especially for product folks who are oftentimes, with the tech lead in the throes of this constrained satisfaction of how do I make sure that all the customers are getting what they need when this platform is really valuable versus a bottleneck that, someone in the enterprise architecture team is forcing them to use our payments API versus just being able to go use Stripe themselves or something like that. And we're a value add versus some kind of constraint that no one really enjoys working with. And I think timelines are an important part. And this is one way of how we can have that conversation.
I appreciate that story. And all I could hear, kind of the resounding theme, is around dependency management, working with other people, making sure other people know what's coming, what's a priority that's now versus later. When do I get help with resolving the differences between these priorities? When do I look for a tie break? And often a milestone is just a mechanism, again, just to have a conversation around, like, you might be working with another team in your organization. They might have other goals that you're unaware of that they're getting measured against. And maybe this one thing is just one of 30 things that they know that they have to do in the next couple months. And you want to get to the point where you're really digging below the surface and knowing that, and then surfacing where those discrepancies exist. You also talked about sequencing, and there's an element of some things just kind of have to happen first for it to make sense for a customer. And so, but then there's all the other technical elements that can happen first out of order in order to mitigate the risk. And if you're looking at a timeline, even if it's just rough, Q4, we know we want to solve these problems in Q4. What must be true in order for us to do that? Because the sales team needs access to these features. They want to sell this thing, or that the customer is really dissatisfied, or we've got a big vehicle launch and we need it.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. Two things you brought up there I want to double click on a little bit. One of them is if there's some other launch happening. And this is especially if you're at a company that has maybe like a hardware and software combination that needs to come together. And hardware by nature is going to be more waterfall, and there's going to be things that are a lot more fixed. And there's a double-edged sword to that. I think one of them is the organization is going to have some more level of structure and constraints, and it's going to force you to think about some stuff up front because locking in hardware design is harder to change. At the same time, I think the risk is that mindset can very easily permeate into the rest of the organization more than it has to, where you assume that the software has to be built to the same level of structure and rigidity as hardware. And knowing what is hard and what is soft, I think, and what is more malleable is something that I think, especially if you used to be a hardware company and you're adding software to it. Those other companies I've noticed that tend to be most at risk of that more waterfall mindset permeating in, and assuming that ridiculous Gantt chart that's required to like launch like a fitness wearable, or especially like a car, that has been tried and tested over decades, will then having the audacity to question timelines is something new that I think the software team can do. Knowing that there's a lot more malleability in our end, and if not anything else, just understanding like what parts of the software need to be done for different phases of the hardware development, and getting testing and validation and other things lined up in lockstep, so that there's less of a big bang test at the end, because most of the kind of subcomponents and the integration between hardware and software have been tested as the hardware comes into play. Hardware being more complex, I think, tends to usually be the drumbeat that the software team can then go and adjust and be more flexible towards in terms of prioritization and timelines and other things like that. And then the second thing that I think came up for me when you said stakeholder management or dependency management was whether you're working at an enterprise, and especially if you're working at a startup that's venture funded, there will guaranteed be some stuff we're doing just to like get more funding, right? We're running out of runway here. Our investors seem to be really excited about ABC. And so we're going to have to sort of somehow force fit, bend over backwards in our roadmap to do something that's more for funding, that's a business value thing, versus necessarily a straight line to customer value. And it's the same thing there, where I think a little bit more understanding of what the investors tend to be excited about and why they're excited about it is really useful to understand. And product folks pushing upwards on those conversations, I think, is also really key. So that if we are straying from like that linear path of where we think the most customer value is, because of something like stakeholder value that needs to get forced in there, understanding a little bit more allows us to also ideate what's the minimum effective dose of something versus over-engineering something beyond which the investor didn't care anyway, but we ended up putting way more effort into it, and we would have gotten the funding whether we did the 1x version or the 5x version. And so that's another piece that I think really needs to come into mind. And as enterprises are adopting a little bit more of a metered funding, I think having those really clear understanding of what's important to the customer, but also what's important to the investors and shareholders, and why, is another piece that can really help with unlocking satisfied constraints in a roadmap.
Absolutely. And just, you said roadmap, which leads me to the biggest way to suss out all of that and pull it apart is with that artifact, probably in different amounts of detail and fidelity depending on who you're talking to. But ideally you have more detail within the next 1 to 2 quarters in terms of timing and maybe down to what features you think. And then as you're looking out 6 months plus, it's around problems that you're expecting to solve. So that benefits the sales team, that benefits other stakeholders, that benefits maybe another product manager in another area of your organization solving a similar problem around payments. Hey, we're also looking at solving a problem around payments. Let's make sure that we don't both solve it differently. And so always keeping that artifact up to date, always making sure that the why or the desired outcome is clear. Super important, and also great just to get everybody on the same page every time you talk.
As much as I started by saying that timelines are oftentimes very top of mind and it's something that comes up, and it's not necessarily a forgotten conversation, I do think that we sometimes forget to ask about what next. So you've got this March deadline because of ABC. And on the ABC side, what's the next thing? Is there something in June or July? And so that's one thing that I think I myself have forgotten to talk about. And it's an opportunity to understand where that business strategy is from another lens, if you haven't already, or a forcing function for whoever's on the other side of that team, that's the stakeholder with these timelines, to think about what next. which in some cases, unfortunately, does tend to be the case where there isn't that foresight. That are asking the question tends to be that first seed that's planted. And the next thing I think is, depending on the level of trust, there's also an opportunity to bring in that timeline. And it can be like a very counterintuitive and sometimes risky way that can lead to like a high level of trust being built with the stakeholders, where they say, hey, we need this done by March. And if you were to go back and say, hey, how about by November, I can give you this low fidelity version, and you can maybe find 3 customers that would most want this, that we can show them this lower fidelity version. It sometimes also can act as like a really awesome conversation starter around who those 3 beta testing customers or early adopter customers are. And then, going back to some of the early conversations we did in a previous episode around who's this for, timelines can also help unlock the who's this for if you try and stagger who you're rolling it out to. And then it's a very healthy debate to have around which subsegment of your customers you want to really go prioritize first. That would likely be super delighted if you're right about your instincts about the product, even if it's not the fully robust version, because it's so compelling of a problem that they have identified for themselves that they'll even take something that works not all the time, but works way better than their current process or their current manual process. And also help you prioritize who the subsequent segments of your customers are. And then it could be a collective win where, if it's an enterprise, we could say that, hey, we wanted to get this out by Q1, but we actually managed to squeeze in something by Q4 of the previous year. And that can have some downstream implications for fundraising, investor relations, other things like that too. And having that discussion around timelines, who it's for, what it's for, why that timeline, and digging a little bit deeper than taking it for face value can easily lead to some new ideas being spurred. And then I think going back to what Bailey said before, that's also a great way if you're looking to be a change agent from transitioning your organization in baby steps from project-based to product-based, where stakeholder trust can be earned by something like that then leads to moving away from these big waterfall Gantt chart-like things into something that looks more like a roadmap and flow that has more malleability built into it, where everyone is bought in versus skeptics that are slowing us down and we forgot to slow down and earn trust for.
In the question, when do we want to do this? There's the when, and then there's defining what this is. And I think you're driving at some of that, which is like, what is the migraine as opposed to the headache that you like to say. I listen to Melissa Perry's podcast quite often, and she kind of plus one it, which is, you can't be the PM that never promises a date, because other people then can't do their job. Sales can't do their job effectively. There might be stakeholders that can't, and so it's just a matter of, you're not saying Tuesday the 11th, but you should be able to say within a month for things that you're working on right now. So I think there is a balance between when you should be communicating a date and when you have an excuse to say, hey, we still got more work to do. So the closer 100%. To today, the more detail you should be giving. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then being transparent about the uncertainties of why you can't give the date in the future, and then collectively maybe prioritizing the de-risking of that. So even if your stakeholder doesn't have the date they're looking for, they at least know, like, hey, this test that we did, this experiment that we ran, the spike that we did, did it work or not work? And if it worked, then you're saying, hey, I've got an update. Number one, it worked. Number two, we're likely going to have a better answer for you on something we didn't before. Or very often, especially if you're trying something really audacious, it's like, hey, that spike didn't even work. So we're back to the drawing board, and this like timeline's totally thrown out. And that's going to tell them well before they expect something to be launched to get into the octagon and like rumble with like what we're up against very early, where they likely have a lot more influence to change whatever their customer expectations are, or maybe bringing in a different partner, even if it's going to throw the business model out, but rethinking it. And that's definitely a shielding your stakeholders from the uncertainty is something to be done very carefully, I think, where people do like simple answers around dates, but the more that everyone agrees and understands that there's what the complexities are behind that simple answer, the asterisks, if you will, around the date. And that's something that we know as PMs. We know what the scariest thing is that's baked into this. But we sometimes forget to tell people, or tell people from our lens of seeing it across what the risks are from the technology, the customer, the business model, and all of it.
Ultimately, it's sharing those risks in the form of a hypothesis too. It's just saying we think that this is going to happen. We might be wrong though. Nobody can predict the future. So.
Yeah, and any advice on how to have that, like there's some level of vulnerability that I think is coming across in terms of not sharing that very highly precise answer and could be looked upon as maybe incompetence or something. And I wonder if, you've had any success with anything specific around how to maintain the trust while also showing a little bit more what's under the hood. What's
worked well for me is, that some people say CEO of the product as a PM or product manager. And I think, that's since been debunked. And really you are facilitating this group of people and you're formulating opinions about the project or product that you're building, but you've got to take the ego out of it. You want to invite everybody else into the conversation, especially people with expertise that you don't have and you don't share, and you won't gain in the next 3 months. And the way to do that is to share the risks, because maybe somebody thinks that risk is actually pretty small. And then you both benefit from that. Or maybe somebody plus ones that, and then you're like, hey, we gotta run at this and we need help. We need to make a hire. We need to talk to somebody external to this company. And so I think, I don't know, it might be a kind of a naive viewpoint, but in sharing my risk, I don't think that reflects anything on me or my competency. If anything, it invites other people and their competencies to come help solve the problem and make it better.
Yeah, I think there's something about the tone there of if you see an issue and you're calling out the issue, you haven't necessarily taken a beat to think about, hey, what can I do about this issue? And maybe do I need anyone else's help to try the first few things? Maybe let me go and trying the first few things could be as simple as Googling it.
Totally.
One of the most frustrating things if someone hasn't looked up how is the industry solving this problem before raising it as a big flag, versus coming to you with just slight level of effort of, hey, this is something that's come up. So far, we've identified these options that we're evaluating. That's the next step. If you have any other options that come to mind, let us know. Otherwise, we'll we'll come back with a priority. And it feels like a very different conversation than, hey, this is a problem that come up. I need help. Where you lose a lot of credibility if you don't show that agency to be able to solve this problem by yourself. And instead, you want to be someone who's saying, I can solve it by myself, but I'm pretty sure I'll be better off if I get a few more eyes on this. And maybe when it comes to execution after we've made the decision, a few more hands to help. But this is what I'm thinking. And I think even when you and I have worked together, it's something that I've really appreciated that you've done and folks on your team did, compared to just throwing up the flag without a plan.
Yeah, and I should clarify too, I'm glad you said that, because you don't want to be the noisy one that's got a bunch of problems on your lap and then you're just throwing them at everybody else to solve. And the other side of that, I'm thinking of a diagram in my head. You've got the risk and then you've got the mitigation or the proposed mitigation strategy. And with every risk you share, there should be a mitigation strategy, and people might be able to make that better or give you an additional viewpoint, but you have to lead with what you know based on the work that you've done to this point.
Yeah, and there's a kind of product-y metaphor too in terms of your audience when you're sharing this, where you're going to have a different talk track for the risk depending on who you're talking to. And I feel like it's very much something that we should be responsible for in terms of not hiding any risks, of course, but also being intentional about how we're communicating the risk depending on the level of control that the audience has in terms of helping us de-risk it. And I think there's a segment from a Brene Brown book once where she talks about a CEO she was coaching who wanted to try and be more vulnerable and wanted to kind of just go out and tell the team that they're under-equipped or that it's not going to work. And her coaching was really around, no, absolutely not. That's not being vulnerable. That's kind of like taking space, or I forget exactly what she said. And it's really a matter around knowing who your audience is and who can help you, and sharing the risks with folks who can help you. So I think that definitely falls squarely back into timeline management.
Milestones and dates. Yep.
There's nothing that earns trust better than making your milestones, whether that's right or wrong. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for hopping back on and getting to talk timelines.
Love talking timelines.
If there's one thing.
Whoa, invigorating. No, I'm just kidding. No, I love being here. It's fun.
So yeah, I look forward to having you on and talking about the other 4 or 5 crucial conversations that we listed out. Definitely make sure to, for the audience, subscribe so that you get a notification when we release the other of the 9 conversations there. And also check for a link to the ebook in our show notes, as well as the previous episode we did about all 9 of the conversations at a super high level. Thanks again, Bailey, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.